You ever gonna get rid of that old mutt? Russ Tanner's voice hit from behind, rough as the gravel under Evan's boots. Wasn't even yours to begin with. You can barely pay the bills with all the feed and vet junk that comes with him. Evan tightened his grip on the leash before turning. The words shouldn't have stung anymore, but they still did. Russ stood at the edge of the yard, rent notice folded in his greasy hand, a smirk already waiting for the flinch he knew would come. Evan didn't give him one, he just said, "Morning, Russ," quiet and steady, like naming the day could keep it from getting worse. Scout stirred beside him, tail giving a faint, hopeful thump against the dirt. The dog looked up at him the same way he always did, trust first, questions later. "You'd save a lot if you stopped feeding memories," Russ said, voice sour with beer or jealousy or both. "She's gone, Evan. That dog don't bring her back." Evan nodded once because arguing would have meant admitting how close to the edge he already was. "Maybe," he said, "but he's still here." He handed Russ a folded envelope, part of the rent, not enough to please him. Russ grunted, unfolded it anyway, and counted right there in front of him, licking a thumb before each bill. "You're short again," he said. 2 weeks, or I find somebody who can pay on time." He walked off before Evan could answer. When the sound of Russ's truck faded, Evan let out the breath he'd been holding. Scout nosed his hand, tail brushing his leg. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "Let's walk." The leash clicked against Scout's collar, an old sound, almost sacred now. They followed the narrow path toward the dunes, wind pushing at their backs. Evan didn't think about Russ. He thought about Marianne, how she used to call out from the porch, "Take him to the edge for me," when she was too sick to go herself. Back then, the walks had been for her. Now they were all he had left of her. Scout trotted ahead, slow but determined, sniffing every step of the way. Evan watched him and thought how strange it was. This animal who'd loved her first, now loving him because she'd asked him to. Keeping the dog had never been about sentiment. It was about keeping the line between what was lost and what still lived. They stopped where the sand met the water. Scout sat, panting, eyes on the horizon. Evan crouched beside him. "You hear that wind?" he said quietly. "It's her voice some days." Still telling us to keep going, Scout leaned into his shoulder, warm and solid. Evan stayed there until his legs went numb, and the tide began to creep closer. When he finally rose, he gave the leash a gentle tug. "Good work, good heart, good day," he whispered. The old prayer Marianne had left behind like a secret code only the two of them still understood. If you felt this moment, if you believe small promises still matter, hit subscribe to follow Evan's story. The light in the kitchen was the soft gray of early morning, the kind that never really decided to be day. Evan stood by the counter with his hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, watching steam that wasn't there. The wind scraped faintly against the siding, the tide pulling and letting go somewhere beyond the dunes. Scout lay by the door, chin on his paws, waiting. The leash hung from a nail, the same place it always had. Evan didn't move to take it down just yet. Some mornings he needed a moment before he could start the ritual again. He closed his eyes and saw her. Marianne in that faded blue sweater, the one she used to wear even when summer light filled the house. She'd sit at the table with Scout's head resting on her lap, one hand tangled in his fur, the other tracing circles on the rim of her coffee mug. "You know he's the best part of me," she used to say. He'd laugh and tell her that wasn't fair. "Maybe," she'd say, smiling without looking up. "But when I'm gone, he'll still be here to keep you in line." She'd said it lightly, but back then the word gone didn't carry the same weight it would later. When the illness came, it wasn't loud. It stole her by inches, not days. Scout learned before he did, staying near her, quiet as breath. Evan used to watch them, wondering how a creature could understand so much without language. On her last morning at home, she'd reached for Evan's hand, the skin cool but the grip strong. "Promise me," she said. He thought she meant about Caleb, about the house, the bills, everything that was breaking at once. But she looked past him, to the dog curled at her feet. Promise me you'll keep him. He'll remind you of what's good. He remembered the way Scout had lifted his head then, as if he'd been listening. Marianne smiled faintly and whispered the line she said every morning since he'd known her. Good work, good heart, good day. The kind of phrase too simple for ceremony, but too steady to die. Now, years later, Evan whispered it back into the still air. Good work, good heart, good day. His voice sounded smaller than hers ever had. Scout's tail brushed the floor once, a slow rhythm like breath. Evan finally set down the cup and reached for the leash. The click of metal on metal broke the quiet. Come on, old boy, he said. Time to keep the promise. Scout stood with a low groan, shoulders stiff but willing, and followed him out into the morning. The air smelled of salt and iron. Evan didn't pray anymore, not the way he used to, but he found that saying the words, the ones she'd left behind, still did the job. It wasn't about asking for anything. It was about remembering what mattered enough to keep. The notice was taped crooked on the front door. The ink bled from last night's fog. Final warning, it read, the words heavier than the paper they were printed on. Evan peeled it off carefully, folded it in half, and slid it into his back pocket before Caleb could see it. The boy was at the table with a bowl of cereal, half-eaten, humming to a tune from the radio. Scout lay beside his chair, eyes following each spoonful. Eat up, Evan said, forcing a tone that didn't sound like fear. Bus comes in 10. Caleb looked up, chewing slowly. You working late again? Maybe. Depends on the doc. Russ said they're cutting shifts. Evan paused just long enough for the lie to catch in his throat. Not me. He gave a short nod, like that settled it. Caleb went back to eating, but Evan saw the flicker in his eyes, the same wary knowledge he used to have as a kid when his own father lied about the bills. When the boy left for school, the silence came rushing back in. Evan set the cereal bowl in the sink, filled it with water to hide the crusted edges, then opened the drawer where he kept the envelopes. The stack was growing like a slow illness. Rent, utilities, vet reminder, one from the hardware store he hadn't paid since spring. He shuffled through them until he found the smallest one, opened it, and counted the bills. $57. He stared at the number until it blurred. Scout patted over, resting his chin on Evan's knee. You eat better than I do, Evan said, trying to smile. He pulled open the cupboard, shaking out the last of the dry dog food. We'll stretch it, he murmured. Later, down by the dockyard, the foreman passed around the news. 3 men laid off, more to come. Evan worked through his shift without speaking, his hands raw from salt and rope. The air smelled of diesel and low tide, and every sound, chains clattering, gulls crying, seemed louder now that the future had gone quiet. He finished early, walking home with a toolbox and the hope of one more repair job waiting. A neighbor had asked about a broken porch rail. Small work, maybe $20. He took it without thinking, hammer echoing through the thin afternoon light. Sweat and splinters were easier to manage than worry. When Caleb came home, he found Evan on the floor with a pile of scrap wood. Homework first, Evan said, nodding toward the table. Caleb sat down, eyeing the folded envelope that stuck out of his father's pocket. Dad, he said softly, are we okay? Evan didn't look up. He kept sanding the edge of the board until the grain smoothed under his hand. We're fine, he said. Always fine. Scout lifted his head, watching them both, tail twitching once. Evan reached down, brushing sawdust from the dog's fur. We'll figure it out, boy, he whispered. We always do. If you've ever fought to keep things together when no one's looking, like this video, it helps more than you know. The kitchen smelled faintly of peanut butter and coffee gone cold. Evan stood at the counter, spreading the last bit of jelly across 2 slices of bread, careful to make it even. Caleb sat on the floor beside Scout, tying one shoe, then the other, his hair still damp from the quick shower he took to save on hot water. The boy's backpack leaned against the wall, frayed at one strap. Evan checked the lunch bag twice, pretending not to notice how light it felt. "Dad," Caleb said, voice half curious, half guarded. "Are we moving again?" Evan froze mid-reach for the thermos. The question hit too cleanly, like a nail driven straight. He forced his hand steady and screwed the cap tight. "What makes you say that?" "I heard you talking to Mr. Tanner yesterday," Caleb said. "He sounded mad." "He's always mad," Evan said with a short laugh that didn't sound real. "It's just Russ being Russ." Caleb didn't smile. "You said that last time." Then we packed. Evan set the thermos down, turned, and crouched to meet his son's eyes. Caleb's face was all questions and quiet trust, a mix that made lying feel like betrayal and necessity at once. "We're not moving," Evan said. "We're fine here." I promised. Caleb studied him, then nodded, not entirely convinced, but willing to believe. "Okay." He zipped his backpack and went back to tying a tighter knot on his laces. Evan rose slowly, exhaling through his nose. The promise hung in the air like steam that wouldn't fade. He looked around the small kitchen, paint peeling near the window, the hum of the fridge too loud, the corner chair wobbling each time someone sat in it. He grabbed his tool pouch and crouched to tighten the screws beneath the seat. The rhythm of the screwdriver turning gave him something solid to hold on to. Scout padded over, nose pressed against Evan's arm. "Don't start, old boy," Evan said softly. "You heard me." "We're staying put." The dog's tail brushed the floor in slow approval, or maybe doubt. When the chair stood steady again, Evan tested it with his weight and nodded to himself. Caleb came over with his jacket half-zipped. "You fixed it again," he said. "Wouldn't want you falling through at dinner," Evan replied. Caleb smiled this time, small but real, and slung his backpack over one shoulder. Scout followed him to the door, nails clicking on the linoleum. Evan watched them both, his son stepping into the morning, the dog sitting at attention as if guarding what was left of their home. After the door shut, Evan leaned against the counter, eyes on the floor where sunlight split through the blinds. The house creaked softly in the wind. He let the truth rise and fall once in his chest before pushing it down again. They weren't fine, not even close, but he'd said the words, and sometimes that had to count as faith. The wind off the water came in steady bursts, strong enough to push sand against Evan's boots and fill the air with the taste of salt. He walked the narrow path between the dunes, one hand in his coat pocket, the other gripping Scout's leash. The dog trotted ahead, nose low, tail swinging like a slow metronome. These walks had become their ritual, the only part of the day that felt untouched by the grind of bills, work, and silence. Evan didn't talk much on them anymore. He used to when Marianne was still alive, when she'd walk beside him, voice soft as the tide. She'd tell him stories about growing up near this same stretch of coast, about the grandfather who experimented with crops that could outlive the sea. He used to listen, half distracted, thinking it was just one of her hopeful dreams. Now those words lingered like an echo too faint to grab. Scout stopped suddenly, head tilted, pawing at something near a dune where the sand dipped lower than usual. "Come on, boy," Evan called, giving the leash a gentle tug. Scout didn't move. He dug harder, sand flying behind him, tail wagging with an energy Evan hadn't seen in weeks. "Hey," Evan said, stepping closer. "Leave it." He crouched down and brushed the surface where Scout had been digging. For a second, something caught the moonlight, a thin edge of glass or metal half buried, glinting faintly before a gust of wind covered it again. "Just trash," Evan muttered, pulling Scout away. The dog hesitated, sniffing once more before following, paws pressing small craters into the damp sand. Evan looked back at the spot, but the glint was gone, swallowed by the shifting grains. He kept walking, though his mind stayed behind. The tide hissed against the shore, retreating and returning like a question he didn't want to answer. Scout trotted ahead again, leash loose, nose pointed into the wind. Evan watched him and thought how the dog seemed to carry purpose even when he himself didn't. Each step Scout took was sure, while Evans felt borrowed from the past. When they reached the bend where the dunes met the broken fence, Evan stopped. The sea stretched out dark and wide, the horizon a thin silver line. "She used to love it here," he said quietly. Scout sat beside him, panting, ears twitching at the rhythm of his voice. "Said the air smelled like a clean slate. I never got what she meant." He rubbed the dog's head, rough but fond. "Maybe you do." Scout leaned into him, heavy and warm. For a moment Evan let himself breathe without counting how many things were falling apart. The wind thinned. The world went still except for the slow roll of the tide. Then Scout barked once, short and sharp, toward the dune they'd passed. "Forget it," Evan said, starting back up the path. "Not everything buried's worth digging up." The storm rolled in without warning, a hard wind that slapped against the siding and sent grit clattering across the windows. Evan stood in the doorway, one hand braced on the frame, watching the street vanish into a blur of rain and sand. The forecast had promised light showers. That was the joke of coastal living. It never kept its promises. Scout had been outside when the first crack of thunder hit. Evan called him twice, then 3 times, voice half lost in the wind. "Scout!" he shouted again, but only the sound of the gutters answered. He stepped out far enough to feel the rain sting his face, then retreated, cursing under his breath. He waited by the door, pacing, glancing at the clock that ticked too loud. When the latch finally scraped, Scout pushed through, soaked and panting, paws black with mud. Evan dropped to his knees, pulling him close. "You dumb old thing," he said, half scolding, half relieved. Scout's whole body quivered, his fur thick with rain and sand. Then Evan saw what the dog carried, something glinting between his teeth. "Hey," he said softly, easing it free. It was a shard of glass, slick with mud, the edges dull from age but the center sealed with a waxy residue that clung to his fingers. He turned it under the light. The piece was curved like part of a jar, the surface etched faintly with something he couldn't make out. Scout whined, pacing, circling back toward the door as if urging him to follow. "No," Evan said, wiping the glass clean with a rag. "We're not going out in that." The dog sat, tail beating once against the floorboards, a soft thump of insistence. Evan studied the shard. The wax looked old, hand-dipped maybe, not factory-made. He thought of the dune where Scout had stopped last night, pawing like he'd found a bone. The thought pulled at him harder than he wanted to admit. He slid the shard onto the counter beside the rent notice, where it caught the light each time lightning flashed. The wind shoved hard against the house again, shaking the door in its frame. Evan stood and walked to the window. Outside, the yard had turned to a shallow pool rippling under the gusts. Scout came to his side, pressing close. "You're telling me something," Evan murmured. "I just don't speak the language." He rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling the tremor still running through him. Behind them, the lights flickered, went out, then flared back dimmer. Evan reached for the flashlight on the counter and caught the edge of the glass with his hand again. The shard was cold, heavier than it should have been. He stared at it a long moment, then shook his head. "Tomorrow," he said. "Whatever it is, we'll deal with it tomorrow." Scout only sighed, curling up by the door, eyes half open as if waiting for the storm to end. By morning, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the sky pale and strange, washed clean but unsettled. The air smelled of salt and iron. Evan stepped outside with Scout close behind, boots sinking into the soaked ground. The dog went straight for the dunes, nose down as if the night had left unfinished business. "Hold on," Evan muttered, tugging the leash, but Scout ignored him, climbing the sandy ridge where the wind had carved a shallow trench. The ground there looked disturbed, fresh claw marks, chunks of wet sand. Evan's pulse quickened, a memory of the glass shard flashing in his mind. Scout barked once, sharp, then began digging with a determination that looked almost human. "Fine," Evan said, dropping to his knees beside him. "Let's see what you've got." His fingers joined the dog's paws in the sand, cold grit packing beneath his nails. An inch down, his hand struck something smooth. He brushed it clear, a curve of glass again, whole this time. The object was round, sealed, the wax dull with age. He lifted it free, water dripping off the sides. Inside, faint shapes shifted, something pale, like seeds wrapped in old paper. Evan wiped the jar clean on his sleeve, reading what was written across the inner wrapping. Harbor Light line, salt test. The words were blurred but legible. His breath hitched. Harbor Light. It was the same name Marianne used to mention when she spoke about her grandfather's work. He'd brushed it off then, thinking it was another one of her coastal myths. "Where did you find this?" he whispered, even though he knew the answer. Scout wagged his tail once, satisfied, then sat in the sand as if the job were done. Evan turned the jar in his hands, inspecting the seal. It was old-fashioned, hand-poured wax around the rim, the kind used decades ago. Whoever had buried it wanted it protected. He could almost picture her grandfather. Broad hands, a spade, the belief that something precious could survive the sea if buried deep enough. He sat there longer than he meant to, the wind lifting strands of his hair, the jar heavy in his palms. His first thought was practical. Maybe it was valuable, maybe it was nothing. His second thought was Marianne, the way she used to talk about starting something that mattered, something that could give back more than it takes. He brushed a thumb over the wax, feeling the faint grit of age. Scout nudged his arm, whining softly. "Yeah," Evan said. "I know. You're the one who found it." He stood, tucking the jar carefully into his jacket. "Let's get home before Russ sees us digging holes on his land." They walked back in silence, the sound of the surf fading behind them. Evan didn't look back, though part of him wanted to. He could feel the weight of the thing pressing against his ribs, fragile and alive in a way that didn't make sense yet. The docks always smelled of oil and tide, of things half alive and half rotting. Evan walked the length of the pier with the jar wrapped in an old towel inside his jacket, the glass knocking gently against his ribs with every step. He hadn't meant to bring it to work, but leaving it in the house felt wrong, unsafe somehow. Scout trailed at his heel, tail low, his coat still holding traces of salt from the morning wind. Russ spotted him before he could make it to the loading bay. "Hey, treasure hunter," he called out, grinning that sharp grin that never reached his eyes. "You dig up any pirate gold yet? Or just more trash?" A few of the men looked up from their crates, waiting for the show. Evan kept walking, shoulders tight. Russ wasn't the kind to let a silence pass. "Heard you out there after the storm, playing in the dunes with your dog. You really got nothing better to do?" He stepped closer, voice dropping low. "Some of us work for a living, you know." Evan stopped. The weight of the jar pressed cold against his ribs like it wanted to stay hidden. "You need something, Russ?" "Yeah," Russ said, folding his arms. "A tenant who pays on time, and maybe one who doesn't act like a fool digging holes in the middle of the night." Scout shifted closer to Evan's leg, a small growl rumbling in his throat. Russ's eyes flicked down, and for a second, the grin faded. "What's that you got there?" "Nothing," Evan said, turning slightly so the jacket covered the shape. Russ chuckled. "Don't tell me it's that jar everyone's talking about." "Word travels fast, man. Half the docks saying you found a relic or something. Maybe a message from your ghost wife." The laughter that followed hit harder than the words. Evan's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. There was no point. He just adjusted his grip on the jacket, gave a low whistle, and started toward the warehouse doors. Scout followed without hesitation, brushing his leg with every step. Behind him, Russ called, "You can't sell dirt, Laird, though knowing you, you'll try." The men laughed again, but softer this time, like they knew they'd gone too far. Inside the warehouse, the air was cooler, quieter. Evan set down his toolbox, unwrapped the towel just enough to look. The jar sat solid and strange in his hands, wax seal dull in the half-light. He didn't know what it was worth. Maybe nothing. But it was his. He could feel that much in his chest. Scout lay down beside him, eyes steady. Evan reached down and scratched behind his ears. "They don't have to believe," he murmured. They never did. Outside, the gulls screamed over the tide. Inside, the sound of Scout's slow breathing filled the space between them. Evan folded the towel back over the jar, tucked it away, and went back to work. The community college sat at the edge of town, its windows dull with salt and years of wind. Evan hadn't been there since Marianne's funeral, when they'd borrowed the hall for the service. Now he stood in front of the greenhouse behind the science wing, the jar heavy in his hands, Scout waiting by the steps like a sentry. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of soil. Rows of wilted plants stretched under tired lamps, and behind them stood a woman in a lab coat patched with coffee stains. "Can I help you?" she asked without looking up. "Maybe," Evan said. He held up the jar. "I found something on the dunes. Thought you might know what it is." That made her look. She was older than he expected, 60s maybe, but her eyes were sharp, curious. She motioned him forward. "Set it there." He placed the jar on a table cluttered with pots and cracked measuring cups. She leaned in, adjusting her glasses. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Behind the rental. Near the fence line, my dog dug it up after the storm." "Lucky dog," she said absently, turning the jar under the light. Her fingers traced the wax seal, then the faded words inside. "Harbor Light Line. Salt test." She said it slowly, like it meant something. "This handwriting looks mid-century. Where did you say you lived?" "Harbor Light Road." Her brows lifted. "That's funny. There was a research project in the 50s, hybrids bred to survive brackish soil. Funding ran out after the floods. People assumed everything was lost." She looked at him now, not just at the jar. "Do you mind if I open it?" Evan hesitated. "Will it ruin it?" "Not if I'm careful." She smiled faintly. "Science doesn't always mean breaking things." He nodded and she reached for a scalpel. With patient hands, she scraped away a thin line of wax, pried the seal, and eased the lid off. The air that escaped was faintly sweet, the scent of age and something else, something alive. She poured the contents onto a tray, a dozen seeds, small and pale, each wrapped in paper that had browned around the edges. She unfolded the note. The ink had faded, but the signature was still visible. "H. L. Whitaker," she read aloud. "I haven't seen that name in years." "Marianne's grandfather," Evan said quietly. Dr. Moreno looked up, her expression softening. "Then this isn't just science. It's family." Evan nodded once. She talked about him sometimes. I didn't think much of it. Moreno picked up one of the seeds with tweezers, holding it to the light. "These shouldn't exist anymore. If they're viable, they could change a lot for places like this. Coastal farms dying from salt intrusion. It's a long shot, but..." She smiled again, this time with a spark behind it. "You might have just dug up hope." Evan glanced toward the door where Scout waited, tail brushing the floor as if he already knew. Dr. Moreno's greenhouse was quieter now, the storm having washed the town into a kind of stillness. The only sound was the steady hum of a heater and the faint scratch of her pencil as she took notes. The jar sat open between them, its contents spread across a clean tray. Evan stood on the other side of the table, arms folded, still damp from the walk over. Scout waited by the door again, patient, tail occasionally sweeping the floor. "These seeds," she said finally, her voice low and deliberate, "were designed to do what almost nothing else can, grow in salt." Evan frowned. "Salt? Like the sea?" "Exactly," she said, picking up a magnifier. "Your wife's grandfather worked on hybrids after the flood in 1952. He believed if you could teach crops to live with salt instead of against it, you could reclaim the land." She placed a seed beneath the light, turning it with tweezers. Most thought he failed. But if these survived sealed this long, they might still... She paused. then smiled slightly. Be viable. The word hung in the air. Evan didn't know much about science, but that one he understood. Viable meant alive, possible, not done yet. He glanced at the tiny seeds, pale and fragile as bone dust. What would that even mean now, after all this time? Depends, she said. If they germinate, if they can root in saline soil, it could help farmers all along this coast. Whole fields are dying from runoff, but that's a lot of ifs. Evan looked down at his hands, still rough from dock work. And if it doesn't work? She gave a small shrug. Then you still found something worth remembering. A man's hope buried in a jar. That's not nothing. He nodded, tracing a thumb over the counter's edge. He was her grandfather. Marianne used to talk about him like he was some kind of dreamer. I never believed half of it. Maybe you should have, Moreno said softly, setting the magnifier aside. Dreamers keep the soil from giving up. Outside, the light shifted through the greenhouse glass, streaking the air with color. Evan could see Scout's reflection watching him, ears perked as if listening too. So what now? He asked. I can run a test, she said. Try to germinate a few under controlled conditions. But I'll need time, and I'll need you not to lose that jar. Wouldn't dream of it, Evan said. He glanced again at the tray, at the folded note marked Harbor Light Line. For the first time in months, the ache in his chest felt lighter, like maybe something could still turn. Moreno leaned on the table, smiling faintly. You know, Mr. Laird, people spend whole careers looking for proof that good things can come back after being buried. You and your dog might have just handed me a piece of it. Evan didn't answer. He just nodded once, quiet but certain, holding on to the only word that mattered. Viable. The sound of tape tearing cut through the morning quiet. Evan came out of the kitchen just as Russ smoothed a bright orange notice onto the inside of the door. The paper slapped against the wood in the draft, loud as a warning bell. Russ didn't bother turning around. 2 weeks, he said, voice flat. After that, I need the unit cleared. Russ, no more talking, Laird. He pressed his thumb over the last corner of tape. You're a good man, but good doesn't pay the bank. His tone wasn't angry this time. That almost made it worse. Evan stood there, fists tight at his sides. He could feel Scout stiffen beside him, a low growl rising like thunder in the small room. Easy, Evan muttered, resting a hand on the dog's neck. He's just doing his job. Russ turned, shoulders hunched under his jacket. You've had months of slack. I can't carry you anymore. He paused, eyes flicking toward the kitchen table where Bills sat half hidden under the morning paper. I'm sorry, man. I really am. He left before Evan could answer, boots thudding down the steps. The sound faded into the wind, leaving the room hollow. Evan stared at the notice. 2 weeks. The words blurred for a second, the letters heavy and final. From the hallway came a quiet voice. Are we getting kicked out? Caleb stood by the door frame, backpack half-zipped, eyes wide. Evan turned quickly, forcing calm into his face. No, he's just reminding me rent's due. I heard him say 2 weeks. Evan swallowed hard. It's how landlords talk, Caleb. Nothing's happening. The boy looked at him for a long moment, like he wanted to believe but couldn't quite reach it. You promised we wouldn't move again. And I meant it, Evan said. Now go grab your lunch. You'll miss the bus. Caleb didn't move. If we don't have enough, we can sell something. Or I can work after school. You're 10, Evan said, sharper than he meant to. The words hit the air like a slap. Caleb flinched, shoulders curling. Evan ran a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. Just let me handle it, okay? Caleb nodded, small and quiet, and went to the kitchen. The chair legs scraped the floor as he sat, the sound of cereal pouring too loud in the silence that followed. Scout lay down between them, head on his paws, eyes flicking from one to the other. Evan reached up and tore the notice from the door, folding it until the paper went soft in his hand. He slipped it into his pocket, where it joined the others he couldn't throw away. 2 weeks, 14 days to make good on a promise that was running out of road. He looked at Caleb, then at the dog, and forced his voice steady. "We're fine," he said again, a lie that had started to sound like prayer. The night came in heavy, pressing against the windows like a slow tide. Evan sat at the table surrounded by papers, rent notices, overtime slips, and the folded letter from Dr. Moreno outlining her plans to test the seeds. The jar sat at the center of it all, clean and cold under the lamplight. He hadn't touched it in hours. He didn't need to. Its presence was enough to keep him from sleep. Caleb came out of his room barefoot, his face pale in the dim light. "You're still up," he said. "Couldn't sleep," Evan replied without looking up. Caleb glanced at the jar. "You're thinking about that thing again." "It's not a thing," Evan said softly. "It's a jar of dirt, Dad." The boy's tone was cautious but steady. "Dr. Moreno said it might be worth something, right? Why not sell it?" Evan looked up then, meeting his son's eyes. "It's not that simple." "Why?" Caleb's voice cracked slightly. "We could pay Russ. We could keep the house. You wouldn't have to work so much." Evan sighed and leaned back in the chair. "It's not about money, Caleb. It's about where it came from. It's just something Mom's dog dug up." The words landed harder than they were meant to. Scout lifted his head from the floor, tail twitching once before settling again. Evan's throat tightened. "Don't talk about him like that," he said quietly. Caleb folded his arms. "You care more about that dog than about us staying here." "That's not true." "Then prove it." Caleb's voice trembled now, but he held his ground. "If you love Mom, do what she'd want." "She'd want us safe." Evan stood, the chair legs scraping the floor. He wasn't angry, just tired in a way that reached bone. "She'd want me to keep my word," he said. Caleb blinked, confusion and frustration mixing in his eyes. "You mean the promise about the dog?" Evan nodded. "And everything that came with it? Scout's what's left of her, Caleb. The best part. I can't trade that for rent money." The boy's shoulders dropped. For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain ticked against the window, soft and relentless. Finally, Caleb said, "Then what are we going to do?" Evan crossed the room, knelt beside him, and rested a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." Caleb didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. He turned toward Scout, who lifted his head as if understanding every word. The dog's eyes reflected the lamplight, warm and steady. Evan brushed a hand over the jar, the wax seal cool under his fingers. Somewhere beneath the weight of fear, a quiet certainty stirred. Love didn't always fix things, but sometimes it was the only thing worth keeping when everything else was slipping away. The greenhouse smelled of earth and copper, the kind of damp that clung to everything. Dr. Moreno moved carefully around the workbench, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, the small trays lined in rows like fragile promises. Evan stood beside her, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, watching steam rise from the soil under the heating lamps. Scout lay by the door again, patient and silent. "All right," she said, straightening. "We'll start with 3 seeds. No chemicals, no additives, just moisture, warmth, and faith." "Faith?" Evan echoed quietly. She smiled without looking at him. "It's a word scientists use more often than you'd think." She pinched the first seed between tweezers and lowered it into the soil. Each one disappeared like a secret being buried. When she finished, she covered the tray gently and stepped back. "Now we wait." Evan leaned against the counter, eyes on the dirt. It didn't look like much, just a handful of earth in a tray. But something in him wanted to believe it was more than that. "How long before we know?" he asked. "Could be a day," she said. "Could be a week. Could be never." He nodded, jaw tight. Waiting wasn't new to him. He'd been waiting since the day Marianne got sick, since the day the bills started coming faster than the paychecks. Still, this kind of waiting hurt different. It carried hope, and hope had a way of making failure sting sharper. By the third day, the greenhouse felt colder. Moreno checked the trays in silence, tapping the soil, sniffing the air. Evan watched her face for any flicker of good news, but her eyes stayed flat, her lips pressed thin. She lifted one corner of the covering and sighed. "It's too wet," she said. The rot set in. Evan stepped closer. The smell hit him first, sour and old. The seeds had collapsed into gray mush, their outlines barely visible. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "For these, yes." She lowered the covering again, her tone soft. "Sometimes the first attempt fails doesn't mean the work's wasted. We learn what not to do." He nodded, though the words barely reached him. He reached for the jar on the shelf, heavier now that disappointment had weight. "Maybe it was a bad idea to start. Or maybe you started at the only time you could," Moreno said. "Come back tomorrow. We'll plan again." But he didn't answer. Scout was already at the door, tail low. Evan gave a small wave of thanks and stepped out into the drizzle. The sky was a dull pewter, and the street shimmered with shallow puddles. He walked slowly, the jar tucked under his arm, every step landing with a soft splash. Scout trotted ahead, glancing back as if to make sure he was still coming. "Guess not everything's meant to live twice," Evan murmured. Scout paused, turned, and barked once, short, defiant, before moving on. Dr. Moreno found the letter wedged under the greenhouse door, the envelope marked with a corporate logo she didn't recognize. The edges were clean, deliberate, nothing like the mail that usually passed through her small desk. She opened it with the same care she used on the jar. Evan stood a few feet away, Scout lying between them like a line of quiet patience. The letterhead read North Shore Biotech. The tone was colder than the paper it was printed on. "Dear Dr. Moreno," it began, "we were informed of your recent inquiry regarding materials labeled Harbor Light Line. These assets, including genetic derivatives, may fall under the intellectual property of our acquisition portfolio." Evan frowned. "What does that even mean?" Moreno skimmed further, lips tightening. "They're saying it might belong to them." Belong? It was buried in the dunes for 70 years. They didn't even know it existed. "That's how companies work," she said, voice flat. "They buy the ghost of an idea and call it theirs." She turned the page. "They want access to the jar for evaluation and verification of origin." Evan folded his arms. "And if we don't, they'll push. Quietly first, then legally, they always do." He stared at the letter, the words running together. The jar sat on the counter beside them, sunlight hitting the glass until it gleamed like something alive. "You told them about it?" "I mentioned it to a colleague," she said, "strictly academic. I thought if anyone could help test the soil compatibility." He shook his head, not angry, just tired. "Guess that was my mistake, thinking we could keep this simple." Moreno set the papers down, her eyes on him now. "You still can. Don't let fear turn this into another thing lost to dust. We can test again, quietly. But you need to decide who this belongs to." Evan looked at Scout, who lifted his head at the sound of his voice. "It belongs to her," he said finally. "To Marianne, to whatever she believed in when she kept talking about this place." He picked up the letter, folded it once, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "No one's taken it." Moreno didn't argue. "Then we move carefully. If they smell value, they'll circle back outside." The wind kicked up, scattering leaves across the glass roof. Evan turned to go, but she stopped him with a quiet call of his name. "Evan, if this becomes more than science, you'll need people. Don't try to carry it alone." He nodded, though he already knew he would. "That's never really been my choice." When he stepped outside, the air felt heavier, the kind that pressed down on the lungs. Scout walked ahead, leash loose, tail flicking through puddles. Evan reached into his pocket, crumpling the letter once before shoving it deeper. It didn't belong to them. It never would. If you've ever had something worth protecting, no matter the cost, hit subscribe to see how Evan stands his ground. The wind howled in from the sea, dragging sheets of rain sideways across the dunes. Evan leaned into it, jacket plastered to his back, one arm cradling the jar beneath his coat. The storm had come faster than the last one, angrier, as if the ocean itself wanted to take back what they'd stolen. Scout was barely visible ahead, a moving blur of gold and grit against the gray. "Come on!" Evan shouted over the roar, though his words vanished into the wind. They reached the crest of the dune where the path dropped toward the water, and he stopped, chest heaving. The world below was chaos, waves smashing against the shore, sand tearing loose like smoke. He pulled the jar from his coat and held it up to the sky. It caught the faintest flash of lightning, glowing for an instant before going dark again. "You hear that?" he said to no one. "They want it back." His voice cracked on the last word. He didn't know if he meant the sea, the company, or the ghosts of everyone who'd left him to carry things alone. He looked down at the glass, at the seeds trapped inside. The label was smudged now, the ink bleeding from where water had seeped through his sleeve. It all felt foolish suddenly, this belief that something so small could change anything. Rent overdue, jobs drying up, and now a storm trying to tear the land apart. What good was a handful of dead seeds? He took a step closer to the edge. The wind pushed against him hard enough to stagger. Scout barked once from behind, sharp and urgent. "Go home!" Evan shouted, but the dog didn't move. Instead, Scout planted himself at Evan's feet, pressing his body against his legs to hold him still. "Don't," Evan muttered, but the dog's weight was solid, immovable. Rain streamed down his muzzle, eyes locked on Evan's face. The message was simple and stubborn as always. Stay. Evan's grip on the jar tightened. He felt the tremor in his hands, the edge of breaking. Then, beneath the noise of the storm, he heard something else, the faint rattle of the seeds inside. A sound like dry hope refusing to die. He lowered the jar slowly, breath unsteady. "All right," he whispered. "You win." Scout leaned his head against Evan's knee, a single grounding gesture that steadied everything. Evan sank down beside him, shielding the jar under his coat once more. The two of them stayed there until the worst of the rain passed, the storm moving inland, leaving behind the low hiss of waves smoothing out the wrecked sand. When he finally stood, the jar felt heavier, but not like a burden anymore, more like a reminder. Weight you choose to carry because it means something. Evan looked out at the horizon, dark and endless, and let the wind wash his face clean. "We'll try again," he said quietly. Scout wagged his tail once, slow and sure. The storm had stripped the dunes bare, carving new scars into the landscape. Evan walked the ridge at first light, the air sharp with salt and aftermath. Scout trotted a few steps ahead, sniffing every patch of disturbed sand, like he was following the ghost of the night before. The sea was calmer now, its roar turned to a low breath, but everything else looked rearranged. Fence posts leaning, bits of driftwood scattered like bones. They reached the spot where the jar had first been buried. The surface was torn open again, a small crater filled with rainwater. Scout paused at the edge, then started digging, pause steady and deliberate. "Not again," Evan muttered, but the dog kept going, throwing sand behind him in frantic bursts. "You're gonna hit China if you don't quit." Scout barked once, then nosed something metallic half buried near the roots of a dune grass clump. Evan crouched, brushing the sand away with his hands until the shape came clear, a thin, rectangular piece of brass, tarnished but solid. He lifted it, turning it in the gray light. The letters were faint but still legible. HL Line 3-1952 Trial Bed. He stared at it, rain dripping from his hair onto the plate. The initials, HL. He'd seen them before, etched in the faded note inside the jar. H.L. Whitaker, Marianne's grandfather. Her stories came rushing back all at once. The ones about him working these same dunes, about failed harvests and salt water creeping into the fields. He could almost hear her voice saying he never gave up on the land even when everyone else did. Scout whined softly, leaning into his leg. Evan wiped the plate with the edge of his sleeve, the brass catching a glint of weak sunlight. "You found his mark," he said quietly, "after all this time." He sat down in the sand, turning the tag over in his hand. The metal was cold but alive with history. Trial bed. That meant these dunes weren't random. This was where the experiments had happened. The buried jar hadn't been lost. It had been placed, protected. Evan looked out toward the horizon, the water gleaming like molten steel. "This is where he worked," he murmured. "Where she played when she was a kid. And where we ended up." He gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Guess the line never really broke." Scout lay beside him, head resting on Evan's boot, eyes half closed. The wind brushed over them, lighter now, carrying the smell of wet sand and seaweed. Evan slipped the brass plate into his pocket, next to the folded letter from Moreno and the last notice from Russ. For once, the weight there felt like something he could stand to carry. He stood, brushing the sand from his jeans. "Good work," he said, his voice steady. "Good heart, good day." Scout's tail thumped once against the ground, slow and proud. Evan took one last look at the dugout patch before turning back toward the house, the brass tag pressing warm against his leg, a quiet proof that some promises really did run in the blood. The brass tag lay on Dr. Moreno's desk between them, polished clean now, the letters catching light. Evan had brought it to her first thing that morning, still damp from the dunes. She'd studied it without a word for a long time, her fingertips tracing each engraved line like a prayer. "This confirms it," she finally said. "Harbor Light Line 3, the third trial bed. He really was testing salt-tolerant strains right here." Evan nodded. "Guess the family stories were true." Moreno smiled faintly. "They usually are." She glanced toward the germination tray where the second round of seeds waited. "If this works, Evan, it's not just local history, it's a breakthrough. I could publish the findings. We'd get attention, maybe funding. You'd have to come forward as the discoverer." He hesitated. "And the company that sent that letter? They'd come sniffing around again, yes. But if we make the science public first, they can't claim it. Truth has a way of holding its ground." Evan looked down at his hands, cracked, rough, built for wood and rope, not laboratories. "I'm not much for papers and meetings. I just want to see it grow." Before Moreno could answer, the door creaked open. Russ filled the frame, cap pulled low, eyes flicking from Evan to the table. "Heard you two've been digging up treasure again," he said. Moreno frowned. "This is a private workspace." Russ ignored her, stepping closer. "Relax, Doc. I'm just here to collect what's mine. My land, my tenant, my find. That jar came out of my dunes." Evan stood quiet but solid. "They're not yours, Russ. You didn't plant what's under there." Russ snorted. "You think the bank cares about that? I got liens on every square foot you're standing on. You want to keep the place, you cut me in." "Cut you in on what?" "We don't even know if it'll grow." "Then I'll take my chance on the if," Russ said. "Better than your luck's been lately." The silence that followed was tight enough to snap. Moreno stepped between them. "Gentlemen, stop. This isn't about ownership. It's about stewardship. If these seeds are viable, they belong to the world, not a ledger." Evan's jaw tightened. He looked at Russ, then at the trays of soil. "You both can publish or profit or whatever you want later. But I'm planting the next round myself. No sale, no shortcuts." Russ laughed, short and mean. "You? What are you, some kind of farmer now?" Evan met his eyes. "Just a man keeping a promise." Moreno held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Then we do it your way." By hand, Evan exhaled, steady and sure. Scout thumped his tail once from the doorway, as if giving his approval. "Let the world wait," Evan said. "We'll let the ground decide who it belongs to." The night settled cold and quiet over the dunes, the kind of stillness that made every sound feel sacred. Evan worked by the light of a single lantern, its glow cutting a narrow circle in the dark. The wind had died for once, leaving only the steady hiss of the tide and the scratch of his trowel in the sand. Scout lay nearby, head lifted, eyes tracking every movement. He'd spread out Marianne's grandfather's old note on a flat rock, the paper held down by stones. The handwriting was faded, uneven, but legible enough to guide him. Line 3, 3 inches deep, 6 apart. Salt content, moderate. Whoever H.L. Whitaker had been, he'd written with precision, as if he'd known someone might someday need these instructions. Evan scooped a handful of sand into a tin cup, sprinkled a pinch of salt water across it, and mixed it with the small bit of fresh soil Dr. Moreno had given him. It smelled like something alive trying to remember itself. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see if you're still listening." He knelt, pushing the trowel into the earth. Each row was deliberate, straight as his tired hands could manage. When the holes were ready, he opened the small pouch Moreno had sent. 5 seeds, pale and perfect, preserved from the jar's center. He placed each one like a prayer. Scout shifted closer, paws sinking into the sand. "Keep watch, partner," Evan said. "We're planting ghosts tonight." The dog blinked slowly, tail brushing the ground. The wind lifted just enough to stir the lantern flame. Evan pressed the soil back over the seeds and smoothed the surface flat. "Good work, good heart, good day," he murmured, the words falling from his mouth before he realized he'd spoken them aloud. It was Marianne's phrase, the same one she used before he'd head to the docks, before the world had come apart. He smiled faintly, the ache of it both sharp and warm. He took out the brass plate from his pocket, the one Scout had found earlier that week. He ran a thumb over the engraved words, H.L. Line 3, 1952 trial bed, then pressed it gently into the soil at the edge of the row. The metal caught the lantern light and gleamed, marking the spot. When he straightened, his knees cracked in protest. "If this doesn't work, at least we'll know we gave it a fair shot," he said. The dog gave a soft huff, almost an answer. He packed up the tools, doused the lantern halfway, and sat for a while, watching the horizon. The sea reflected a thin band of moonlight, pale and broken. Somewhere out there was everything he'd lost. Marianne, the life they'd planned, but right here was something that might still grow. Scout laid his head on Evan's boot, warm and solid. Evan rested a hand on his back and closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was burying something. He felt like he was starting again. The mornings came early now, long before the sun cleared the waterline. Evan rose with the light, boots heavy from the previous day's salt, the same ache settling into his shoulders each time he carried the pail. The path to the dunes had become a trail of habit, wet footprints there in the dark sand, a rhythm carved by hope and repetition. Scout always walked beside him, steady and watchful, like he knew the work needed both of them. Each morning began the same way. Evan would check the soil, loosen the crust the wind built overnight, and pour just enough water to darken the rows. The brass plate gleamed faintly in the gray light, a reminder of where the line had started 70 years ago. He knelt by it, brushing away bits of dried kelp and grit. "Good work, good heart, good day," he whispered, the words less prayer now, more routine, something solid to hang on to when nothing else stayed put. The gulls had learned to circle low, curious about the disturbed ground. Evan waved them off with an old tarp, cursing under his breath when they swooped too close. He rigged a small fence from driftwood and rope, not much of a barrier, but enough to say this belongs to someone. Scout patrolled the perimeter, barking once or twice, tail wagging as if the defense itself was victory. By noon the sun would burn through the haze, and Evan would rest in the shadow of the dune, drinking from a dented flask, staring at the untouched sand. Nothing moved there yet. No green, no hint of life. Moreno had said patience was part of the process, but patience was hard to measure when your rent had days left. Some afternoons he'd talk to Marianne out loud just to fill the silence. "You'd laugh if you saw this," he said once, leaning on the shovel. "Me playing farmer, measuring dirt like it matters." The wind caught his voice, carried it toward the sea. "But you always said it would." Scout settled beside him, head on his knee. Evan rubbed the dog's neck absently, feeling the slow rise and fall of breath. "You remember her too, don't you?" he asked. Scout's tail brushed the sand once. It was enough of an answer. As dusk fell, the air cooled, and the tide began its crawl back up the shore. Evan would cover the rows with thin cloth to keep them from the cold. Each night he lingered longer than he needed to, eyes straining for any change. The wind whispered through the grasses, soft and endless, and sometimes he thought he could hear her voice threaded through it, telling him to keep going. Back home, he hung the empty pail by the door, wiped the salt from his hands, and glanced once more at the horizon through the window. Nothing yet, but not nothing forever. Scout's bark tore through the morning quiet, sharp and insistent. Evan jolted awake, the half-light of dawn spilling across the kitchen table where he'd fallen asleep. The old clock ticked steady, but Scout's nails clicked faster on the floorboards, circling the door. "Easy," Evan muttered, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "What is it?" The dog gave one short bark, then turned toward the dunes. That was enough. Evan grabbed his jacket and followed, boots crunching over the damp sand. The air was different this morning, clean still, carrying the faintest trace of salt and earth. They reached the trial bed as the horizon began to glow, the light soft and low. Scout bounded ahead, tail high, then stopped at the edge of the small fenced patch, whining under his breath. Evan slowed, heart pounding faster than he wanted to admit. From a distance it looked the same, flat, pale sand. But as he knelt closer, he saw it. Tiny green threads, thin as hair, breaking through the brine-stained surface. 3, maybe 4 of them, life where there shouldn't have been any. He touched the nearest shoot carefully, afraid it would vanish if he blinked. The stem bent slightly under his fingertip, elastic and real. His breath caught. "I'll be damned," he whispered. Scout gave a soft whine, as if agreeing. The light grew stronger, washing the dunes in gold. The sprouts shimmered faintly, the moisture clinging to them like glass. For the first time in months, Evan felt something in his chest unclench. It wasn't triumph. It was quieter than that. Relief. Grace. He sat back on his heels, the sand cold beneath him, and looked toward the sea. "You see this, Marianne?" he said softly. "They made it. Your grandfather's seeds. They made it." Scout pressed against his shoulder, tail sweeping the ground in slow, steady strokes. Evan laughed under his breath, the sound rough from disuse. "You found it. You old fool, you really found it." He ran a hand through the dog's fur, then looked back at the small patch of green. Each fragile shoot leaned toward the light, stubborn as hope. He stayed there until the sun cleared the horizon, watching the color deepen in the new leaves. The gulls called overhead, circling but keeping their distance as if even they understood this spot was different now. Evan took the brass plate from his pocket and laid it gently in the sand beside the sprouts. "Line 3, he murmured. "Still working." He glanced down at Scout. "Guess that means we keep at it, huh?" The dog barked once, loud and sure, startling a flock into flight. Evan smiled. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." He rose, brushing the sand from his hands. The wind lifted his collar and carried the faint sound of the sea breaking, steady as breath. For the first time in a long while, the day ahead didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to build. The lab smelled faintly of ethanol and damp soil. Dr. Moreno moved carefully between the benches, clipboard in hand, her glasses fogging from the shift in temperature each time she leaned over the microscope. Evan stood by the door, hat in hand, watching through the glass as if any sudden movement might disturb what they'd worked for. Scout waited outside, curled in the shade beneath a bench, patient as ever. "It's holding," Moreno said quietly, not looking up. "The cellular walls are intact even under saline stress." She clicked through the slides, her tone balanced between disbelief and awe. "I've never seen anything like it." Evan frowned, trying to follow. "That's good, right?" "That's miraculous," she said. She turned to him, eyes bright. "These seeds aren't just alive. They're thriving. Your wife's grandfather really did it. He bred a strain that can root in saltwater soil and still reproduce clean." Evan stepped closer, looking down at the tiny green tissue samples glowing under the lens. "So what does that mean?" In plain words, Moreno smiled. "It means hope, Mr. Laird. The kind that comes with numbers." She flipped to a new sheet on her clipboard. "If these results scale, and they will, it could restore tens of thousands of acres of coastal farmland. We ran the economic models. Regional recovery potential sits around $63 million over the next decade." The number hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Evan let out a short breath and rubbed his forehead. "That much," he said, "from a few seeds in a jar." "From faith in the right hands," she corrected. "Science only finishes what belief begins." He smiled faintly. "You sound like her." Moreno tilted her head. "Marianne?" "Yeah, she used to say the same thing, that hope isn't soft. It's work." He looked down at his palms, rough and scarred. "Guess she was right." Moreno set the clipboard aside and reached into a tray for one of the small sprouting samples. She held it out to him, cradled in a bit of soil. "Then this is the work," she said. "What do you want to do next?" Evan stared at the small shoot in her hand. It was no longer just an experiment, it was proof. "We plant," he said finally. "More beds, bigger. The dunes can hold a few rows, and the low flats past the fence, if Russ doesn't throw a fit." "I'll help you draft the soil plan," Moreno said. "You'll need water management, salinity readings, distribution schedules. It'll take people, Evan. Then we'll find people," he replied. Outside, Scout barked once, sharp and clear, as if he understood. Evan glanced toward the sound, smiling. "Guess he's ready to start, too." Moreno laughed softly. "You realize what this could mean? For the coast, for families, for you?" Evan looked out the window at the line of sea against the sky. "I don't need it to mean money," he said. "Just proof that she was right about what can still grow." The man in the suit looked like he'd never walked on sand before. His shoes sank with every step, polished leather turning gray with dust. Evan watched from the edge of the dune, arms crossed, Scout sitting at his side. The rows of seedlings behind them trembled in the sea wind, green lines carving hope into the coastline. "Mr. Laird," the man said, panting slightly as he reached him. "I appreciate you taking the time. I'm Daniel Hurst, North Shore Biotech." Evan didn't shake his hand. "I've seen your letters." "Yes, well." Hurst adjusted his tie, glancing at the dunes as if they were foreign terrain. "We'd prefer to move forward with partnership rather than conflict. Your late wife's grandfather's work technically predates our acquisition records, but we're willing to overlook that in exchange for cooperation." "Meaning?" Evan asked. Hurst smiled the kind of smile that meant money, meaning we're prepared to buy your discovery outright. The samples, the research, the land rights, $63 million in total compensation pending verification. The wind cut across the silence that followed. Evan stared past him toward the horizon where the waves met the light. The number didn't even sound real. "That much for a patch of seedlings," he said quietly. "For the future of coastal agriculture," Hurst corrected. "Handled properly, this project could be global. We have distribution capacity, research funding, legal protection. You'll be credited as the finder, of course. But this," he gestured toward the field, "is bigger than one man." Evan's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know that?" "I think you can't sustain it alone," Hurst said. It's admirable what you've done here, but the world moves faster than goodwill. Take the offer, Mr. Laird. Let the professionals handle it. Evan looked back at the seedlings, the small green blades shimmering in the wind. Scout stood, tail flicking against his leg. This land raised those seeds, Evan said finally. Marianne's grandfather worked it. My wife walked it. My son's growing up on it. You want to buy it like it's a patent, but it's not. It's proof that something here still works. Hurst's expression shifted, a trace of impatience surfacing. You'll regret turning down this kind of money. Maybe, Evan said, but I'll still have what it came from. Can you say the same? The man's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. He looked once more at the field, then back at Evan. This isn't over, he said. It is for me, Evan replied. Hurst turned and started the long walk back toward his car, the wind erasing his footprints as he went. Evan knelt beside Scout, resting a hand on his head. We keep it here, he said softly. Right where it belongs. The dog's tail brushed the sand, slow and certain. The horizon shimmered, the seedlings bending and straightening like they were bowing to the wind. Evan smiled faintly. Good work, he whispered. Good heart. Good day. They held the first meeting in the old church basement, the one with the cracked floor and the smell of mildew that never quite left. Dr. Moreno had pushed the folding tables together, maps and soil charts spread out like a patchwork quilt. Evan stood near the back, hands in his pockets, not used to being the one people looked at when the talking started. Half the town had shown up. Farmers, dock workers, retirees who remembered the floods. Even Russ came, though he kept to the corner, arms crossed. Scout lay by the door, head on his paws, eyes following everything like he was keeping record. All right, Moreno began, tapping the brass plate that sat at the center of the table. Most of you have heard bits and pieces by now. What we've found out on those dunes isn't a miracle. It's a seed line your grandparents once worked for. We're just giving it a second chance. Evan shifted, clearing his throat. It's called the Harbor Light Renewal Project, he said. Not a company, not a sale, just hands and ground. A murmur ran through the crowd. One of the older farmers spoke up. And what's that mean for us? You growing these things yourself? Evan shook his head. No, we grow them together. The seed stays here, no one owns it. We plant, we share the yield, we rebuild the soil. If it spreads from here out, not the other way around. Someone else laughed softly. Sounds like work. Yeah, Evan said, a half smile tugging at his mouth. The kind worth doing. Moreno stepped forward, pointing to the map. We'll start with 3 pilot plots. Lowland fields where salinity's highest. Each farmer involved will keep part of the yield for local use. The rest will study for soil retention and crop rotation potential. No patents, no licensing. Just stewardship. Russ's voice came from the back. And who decides what's fair? You. Evan turned to him. No, the ground does. You can join or walk away, Russ, but you don't get to take more than you give. For a long moment, the room was quiet, except for the hum of the old lights. Then an older woman, widow of a fisherman, spoke. My land's gone to salt since the flood. If these seeds can take root, I'll dig the first trench. That cracked something open. One by one, people started nodding, offering tools, labor, water rights. The room filled with the soft buzz of planning, real work forming in real time. Evan leaned against the wall, listening. Scout came to sit beside him, tail sweeping the floor. Moreno caught his eye and smiled. You did this, she said. He shook his head. No, we did what we were supposed to. The rest is grace. By the time the meeting ended, the sun had dipped low, spilling orange light through the basement windows. Evan stayed behind to stack chairs. He looked at the brass plate still resting on the table and thought how it had once marked failure and now marked beginning. The morning broke warm for once, the air thick with the smell of salt and new growth. Evan was out early, hammer in hand, driving stakes into the soft ground around the first cooperative plot. The seedlings had begun to spread, green veins cutting through the pale sand. Each row looked fragile but sure, the kind of quiet persistence he'd started to recognize in himself. Scout barked once, low and alert, before Evan even heard the truck. The rumble came slow along the dirt road, stopping short near the edge of the field. Russ climbed out, his usual smirk missing, replaced by something that looked like uncertainty. He stood there for a moment, hands hooked in his pockets, then dropped his eyes to the soil before him. Evan didn't say anything. He just kept working, hammer rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a man who knew silence could say more than talk ever would. Russ cleared his throat. "Brought some posts," he said finally. "You mentioned you needed fencing." "I did," Evan said, still not looking up. Russ nodded once, like that was enough permission, and walked around to the back of the truck. He unloaded the posts one by one, the metal clanging against the earth. Scout trotted over to sniff at his boots, tail twitching. Russ reached down and gave the dog a tentative pat. "Still got your old watchdog, huh?" "Still keeping me honest," Evan said. They worked side by side for a while without speaking. The only sounds were the dull thud of hammers and the slow breath of the sea beyond the dunes. When the last post was in place, Russ leaned on his shovel, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. "Never thought I'd see this field green again," he said quietly. "Didn't think anything could come back after the flood." "Neither did I," Evan said. Russ looked at him then, face roughened by years of weather and pride. "Listen, I was wrong about all of it. The dog, the rent, the digging. I thought you were chasing ghosts." Evan paused, then nodded once. "You weren't wrong to doubt. You just didn't stay long enough to see it through." Russ let out a slow breath, half laugh, half sigh. "Fair enough." He picked up another length of wire, testing its weight. "Guess I can stay long enough now." Evan met his gaze, no grudge left between them, only work waiting. "Then grab that end," he said. They finished the fence as the sun climbed higher, shadows shrinking beneath their boots. When the last wire was fastened, Russ stepped back and looked over the rows of young plants moving in the breeze. "It's good work," he said. Evan wiped his hands on his jeans, glancing at the dog resting nearby. "Good heart, too." Russ gave a short nod, and for the first time it meant more than words. By mid-morning the field was alive with motion. The wind off the ocean carried the smell of wet soil and something sweeter, green life pushing through salt and sand. Evan stood at the edge of the plot, hands on his hips, watching rows of sturdy shoots bend but never break. It looked like the sea itself had decided to give something back. Caleb ran between the rows with a bucket, careful not to step on the seedlings. "Dad," he called. "Ms. Kerr brought more compost from the nursery." Evan smiled. "Tell her to set it by the fence. We'll work it in this afternoon." Around them, people moved with purpose. Russ was tightening wire at the far end, his truck parked crooked on the rise. Dr. Moreno knelt near the center row, inspecting leaves with her magnifier, sunlight flashing off the lens. The widow from the last meeting brought coffee in a thermos big enough for everyone, and 2 teenage brothers hauled in driftwood for shade frames. The sound of hammers, laughter, and wind mixed together until it all felt like one voice. The sound of something building instead of breaking. Evan walked the perimeter, stopping every few yards to drive a stake deeper. Scout followed, tail brushing the grass. Children darted past, carrying twine and buckets, their shouts echoing over the dunes. One of them stopped to pat Scout's head. "He's the one who found it, right?" the boy asked. Evan nodded. "Yeah. Couldn't have done any of this without him." The boy grinned and ran off, leaving Scout to look up at Evan as if expecting more praise. "You hear that?" Evan said, kneeling to rub the dog's ear. "Town hero." He straightened and looked out over the field again. The crops were small but holding, leaves strong, roots gripping where nothing should have survived. Moreno caught his eye and lifted her hand in a silent wave. then gestured to the plants. "They're adapting," she said when he came closer. Each new sprout's pulling more from the brine. "The soil's changing for good?" Evan asked. "For good," she said and smiled. "Harbor Light's alive again." Caleb came running up, face flushed, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Dad, look. They're growing in the spots that were all salt last week." He pointed to the lower edge of the field, where the waterline used to kill everything it touched. Now the green reached almost to the tide's mark. Evan's throat tightened. He looked from the plants to the people, neighbors who had once passed him without a word, now working side by side, trading tools and stories, laughter carrying like sunlight through fog. Russ set down his hammer and walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Didn't think I'd see this place look like life again," he said quietly. "Me neither," Evan said. "Guess we just needed to stop waiting for someone else to fix it." The wind swept through the rows, rippling them in waves that mirrored the sea. Evan closed his eyes, letting the sound fill him, that blend of work and hope. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the kitchen clock and the slow rhythm of Scout's breathing at Evan's feet. Evening light came through the window in long stripes, dust floating in it like lazy snow. The day's work still clung to his clothes, the smell of soil, salt, and sweat, but he didn't wash up. Not yet. There was something he'd been meaning to do, something that had waited long enough. He sat at the table and pulled out a clean sheet of paper, the same kind Marianne used to write grocery lists on. The pen hesitated in his hand before he started. His handwriting was rough, uneven, but the words came steady. "Marianne, you left me your heart in a dog and your hope in the sand." He paused, looking down at Scout. The dog's ears twitched at her name. "She'd like that line," Evan murmured. Then he kept going. "I didn't understand at first. I thought keeping Scout was about loyalty, about holding on to what was gone, but it wasn't that. You were giving me work, something alive that needed faith to stay alive. Now I see it was never about the dog. It was about what he'd lead me to." He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. The field was still in his mind, the rows of green moving like breathing, the sound of laughter where silence used to live. He smiled faintly and wrote again. The seeds took. The town came back, even Russ. You'd laugh to see him swinging a hammer for someone else. Dr. Moreno calls it a community renewal model. Caleb just calls it ours. You'd be proud of him, Mari. He's got your quiet strength, and he still talks to Scout when he thinks I'm not listening. Evan's hand slowed. The next words came softer. "I miss you. Every day. But the ache doesn't hollow me out like it used to. It fills things instead, the spaces between work, between breaths. I think that's how love's supposed to age. It doesn't leave, it settles." He folded the letter once, then again, the paper soft under his fingers. On the counter by the door hung Scout's old leash, the leather cracked and worn from years of use. Evan slipped the folded page beneath the metal tag, the one engraved Scout, "If found, come home." He hooked the leash back on the nail and stood there for a long moment. The house felt less empty somehow, the silence more like peace than absence. Scout stirred, padding over to lean against his leg. Evan rested a hand on his head. "We did it, boy," he said quietly. "She'd say it was good work." Scout wagged his tail once, slow and certain. Evan looked toward the window. The last of the sunlight was fading, painting the fields gold one more time. "Good heart," he whispered. "Good day." The storm came without warning, one of those late gales that spun off the open sea and hit the coast like a fist. By dusk, the sky had gone a color between iron and ink, and the air smelled of salt and thunder. Evan was at the field when the first gust tore through, bending the young shoots flat. He dropped his tools and ran for the truck, Scout at his heels, but halfway there he turned back. The rows were too exposed. If the dunes gave way, months of work would vanish in one night. By the time he reached the edge of town, lights were already flickering on in windows. The wind howled through the alleys, slamming doors and throwing sand like hail. He pounded on Russ's door first. "Storm surge!" he shouted. "We'll lose the field." Russ opened the door without argument, already pulling on his jacket. "I'll bring the truck. We can haul sandbags from the old pier shed." Dr. Moreno was next. She'd seen the storm alert flash on her radio and was lacing up her boots. "I'll get the generator and work lights," she said. "Meet me there in 10. Word spread faster than the wind. By the time Evan made it back to the dunes, headlights cut through the darkness in a slow procession. Farmers, dockhands, even teenagers from town. Caleb climbed out of the passenger seat beside him, scarf pulled up to his chin. "You said this is ours," he called over the roar, "so we protect it." They worked by flare and lantern, shoulders hunched against the spray. Russ and two others hauled bags of sand into place, while Moreno shouted measurements through the wind. Evan dug trenches to redirect runoff, the shovel jerking in his numb hands. Scout darted along the fence line, barking warnings as gusts tore at the posts. Every few minutes a flash of lightning split the sky, freezing the scene in brief, blinding photographs, faces streaked with grit, hands gripping ropes, rain coming sideways. "Hold the line!" someone yelled as a wave crashed against the lower ridge, water spilling over the first row. Evan waded into it, pushing sand back with the shovel, his boots sinking deep. Caleb was beside him now, soaked through but grinning, eyes fierce. "Dad!" The lights. The generator flared and went out, plunging them into darkness. For a breath, only the storm spoke. Then Scout barked, a single sharp sound, and Evan felt the dog press against his leg in the black. He reached down, steadying himself. "We're here," he said. "We don't move." Minutes passed like hours. The sea hammered, retreated, and came again. But slowly, the worst began to fade. The wind eased. The rain softened. When the first gray light crept over the horizon, the field was still there, flooded, battered, but standing. The rows had held. Evan sank to his knees, water lapping at his boots. Around him, people laughed weakly, some crying outright. Scout sat beside him, soaked and shaking but alive. Evan rested a hand on his neck. "Good work," he whispered. He looked around at the faces lit by dawn, tired, wet, and shining with something more than survival. The world was still when morning came. The wind had gone, leaving the air soft and full of the smell of salt and new earth. Evan sat on the rise above the field, the damp sand cool beneath him. Scout lay at his side, head resting on his paw, eyes half closed but alert. Below them the rows of seedlings shimmered in the early light, bent, scarred, but alive. He hadn't slept. None of them had. The night had been a blur of motion and noise, of shovels and shouted orders and waves that threatened to take everything back. But now, in the hush that followed, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Caleb slept against a pile of sandbags down by the fence, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought from town. Russ was sitting on the tailgate of his truck, sipping cold coffee, boots caked with mud. Dr. Moreno stood at the far edge of the plot, notebook forgotten at her side, just watching the light move across the green. Evan's body ached from head to toe, every muscle burned, but he couldn't stop smiling. The shoots caught the dawn in 1,000 small reflections, beads of water sparkling on every leaf. Each one was proof that the line hadn't broken, that something planted in faith could outlast the storm. He reached down and ran a hand through Scout's fur. The dog shifted closer, leaning into him. "You did good, boy," Evan said softly. "Better than any of us." Scout gave a faint, tired wag, his tail brushing against the sand. Evan looked out toward the horizon where the sea was turning gold. The sky cleared slowly, the first full light spilling over the dunes, warming his face. For a long moment he didn't think about money or titles, or even the cooperative waiting to start again that morning. He thought of Marianne, the way she'd stood on this same shore years ago, hair whipping in the wind, her hand resting on Scout's back. She'd told him once that hope wasn't a feeling, it was a choice made daily, like breathing or forgiving. He understood that now. He whispered to the open air, his voice barely a breath. "Good work, good heart, good day." The words carried over the sand, soft but certain. Moreno turned at the sound and smiled without speaking. Russ raised his cup in a quiet salute. Even from a distance, it felt like everyone heard the same thing. Some shared understanding that the fight was over, at least for now. Evan stayed there until the sun cleared the water completely. The field glowed under it, green and gold, a living map of everything they'd endured. Scout's breathing slowed beside him, steady and peaceful. "Rest easy," Evan said. "We're home." The sea murmured against the shore, a rhythm older than any of them, and the light kept growing. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to fix, only something to tend. If this ending felt like peace you've been waiting for, hit like and share Evan's story so others can find their own quiet dawn.